Hello crafters and welcome back to the ScrapbookPal YouTube channel. My name is Deepa from DeeZinesByD and I have two cards to share with you today which feature the Pears and Pomegranate suite from Pinkfresh Studio. So along with that, I'm also going to be showing you a technique to create textured backgrounds with some textured paste. And let's just get this out of the way. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We definitely love if you'd subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified of future videos. So let's go ahead and look at these products. We have the Pears and Pomegranate stamp set, which is really cool because you get that full length stamp with some sentiments. Then you've also got the layering the layering stencils, which have 6 stencils, and the dies, which are really unique, I think, because they actually have 2 dies to cut out the sentiments, which you don't always get. So let's get started on those backgrounds. What you're going to need is some texture paste, and it's important to note that you're going to want the opaque option. There are some other options like metallic and translucent and transparent and things like that, but for this technique, I want to use the opaque version because I want to add color to it, and it's not really going to pick up the color much unless you have that opaque facet to it. So I'm basically taking some Pinkfresh Studio Tidal Pond ink, and I'm putting it down on my craft mat here, and I'm just using the texture paste and working it into the ink to blend that color into the paste. Once everything is all nice and mixed and I don't see any streaks or anything, I can go ahead and start applying the paste to my cardstock. So I would recommend using a thicker cardstock if you could, because the texture paste is going to cause the cardstock to warp just a little bit. I'm using an A2 sized panel here, but you can use whatever size you like. Remember, you can always trim it down. Because I've used an A2 sized panel, I'm not 100% sure at this point whether I want to have a border or not. I'm trying to make that paste get to the edges of the paper. So this is where I'd recommend having a page which is a little bit larger. That way you don't have to worry too much about getting the paste on the edges. That's why I'm trying to kind of wipe it off onto the edge and spread it out a bit so that it covers all of the white. Another thing you might want to keep in mind is that if you don't want any of that white showing through, what you could do is use some colored cardstock instead of white. So here's what it looks like after it's fully dried. You can see it has curved a bit, and I've tried to flatten it out by putting it like a bunch of heavy cardstock on top overnight. I did create 2 panels. The second one was made using Passion Fruit Pinkfresh Studio ink, and you can see that when you're choosing your colors, you have to keep in mind that it's going to lighten it up a bit because of the opaque nature of that texture paste. Now let's go ahead and stamp, and you can see here that that stamp is not going to fit in the well of my Misty. So unless you have one of the larger Misties, this is the technique that I like to use. I turn that Misty to the other side or to the left side of my working surface, and what I'll do is place my paper down along with the stamp, and I will fasten that Misty to my table with some tape. That's just some painter's tape. It's nice and strong. It's going to hold it in place. And then I can kind of tape down the white panel that I'm going to do my stamping onto and pick up that stamp with the back of my Misty. The back of the Misty has a bit of like an extra inch and a half, so it will definitely be big enough to do the stamping. So I'm going to stamp this out with some VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink. Now I wanted to double stamp this because I didn't think I got all the little bits fully onto the paper there, and the impression wasn't that great. So you can see you can still manage to get double stamping using this method. Now I'm also going to do another panel since I'm making 2 cards, and for this one I'm going to do some heat embossing. So I'm using some Versamark ink, and I did add some anti-static powder to my panel before doing this. I'm really sorry about the shaking. I'm really trying to get that impression in there so I don't have to do it more than once. And then I'm going to use some Lawn Fawn gold embossing powder to cover the image, and eventually I will heat it up with my heating tool and get that beautiful gold shiny embossing imprint of those beautiful pears and pomegranates. So you see that using the back of the Misty really comes in handy to stamp out these longer stamps that come from Pinkfresh Studio or any other longer stamp sets that you might have. So that's what the final heat embossed version looks like, and there's the black. Now let's move on to the stenciling. There are 6 stencils, and what I like to do is separate my stencils. There's a larger portion for the pears and then a detail stencil, a larger portion for the pomegranates and a detail stencil, and then a larger stencil for the leaves and a detail stencil. So what I mean by the larger stencil is it's what's going to fill in um, the majority of that image. So we've got the pears, the pomegranates, and the leaves. So that's why you have 6 stencils. You can use them in any order you like. There is a recommended order that you can use. They're kind of numbered in the top left corner, but I didn't follow that at all. I just decided to go with the pears first. And I'm starting off with some fresh pear Pinkfresh Studio ink, how fitting. And I'm only adding the ink lightly. I'm not, maybe medium pressure is what I'm doing, and I'm trying to create a bit of a shadow. So I'm not really filling in every little last bit of the stencil to make sure that there's ink in every nook and cranny. And I just like doing that for this technique because it just gives it a bit of shading and gives it a bit more of an artistic look. For the detail portion, I used the fresh pear ink again, and I just added it with more pressure and more ink to make it darker. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the pomegranates. This time I'm using Berrylicious Pinkfresh Studio ink. Again, I'm adding the first layer, which is a larger area of the pomegranates in a lighter fashion, and again creating a bit of a shadow here and there. And then for the detail portion, I'm adding that same Berrylicious ink with more pressure and a lot more ink to make it darker. And there's how those look. So you can see you don't really have to use too many different inks. You can use the same ink a couple times to get different shades of the same ink. So now I'm going and working on the leaves, and for this one I'm starting with sky blue. Now I wanted the leaves to have a bit of a bluey tinge to them, and I like mixing inks like this for one stencil because it just creates a variation of color and just more interest. So now that I'm done with the blue, I'm not moving the stencil, I'm keeping it there. And I'm adding some evergreen ink. And you can see I'm trying to make sure that some of that blue ink is showing through. So I'm not covering the entire stenciled portion with the ink. I'm just kind of trying to get the centers and a little bit of the edges where I don't have the blue so that the blue and the green both show through. So I'll continue to do this for all of the leaves. And you can see that not all of the leaves get filled in. There's some bits that are left empty. And the next stencil will take care of that. So I'll go ahead and add the detail stencil for the leaves. And for this, I'm going to start using some Misty Coast, which is more of a gray ink from Pinkfresh Studio. So those leaves that weren't filled in will be filled in with some gray, which again is just going to create another tone when I mix it with the green. And it won't really fill in the detail portion of those leaves, even though I did add it, because it is a lighter color than the green. So now I'll go ahead and grab that evergreen ink. I'm not changing the stencil. And I will just add it all over those detail areas where there's green underneath. And I'll do that in a heavy fashion so that it does show the detail on that green ink because it's the same green. And then I'll also add just a little bit in those areas where I added gray. Now I'll move on to the next panel. So that's the first panel all done. We are doing another one to go with the second card and the second color scheme. So for this one, I'm using some Ballet Slipper ink by Pinkfresh Studio, which is a nice light pink, and it's just basically going to create some nice pink highlights on our pears. And then for the green portion of the pear, I'm actually using some mint ink, and what I'm trying to do is to have the pink coming from the top left of the pears and then the green from the bottom right. And you can see that's the kind of mixing that you get. When I go to add my detail portions, I'm just going to add the green because it seems to only really cover the green anyways. And again, I'm just adding it a bit heavier so that the ink is a bit darker. Now for the pomegranates, I'm going to add some yellow. So for this one, I'm adding some apricot, which is like an orangey yellow, again from the top left. And then I'm going to add some passion fruit from the bottom right or wherever else I didn't add the yellow or the apricot. So that gives us a nice two-tone pomegranate, just like the pears. Now this time for the detailed stencil, I'm going to add the yellow and the red over top of wherever the yellow and red are on the pomegranates from the first stencil, and just in a heavier fashion, and that looks just a little bit more natural. Not that it's going to be that natural because again, we've chosen colors here that create more of an artistic palette. So moving on to the leaves, for the leaves we're using some Ocean Breeze, which again is a blue but a little bit lighter than the last panel. And then for the green, we're adding some mint here. So the mint is actually, again, it's just going to highlight, or it's going to be the main color of the leaf, and then the blue underneath is going to be what the highlights are for the leaves. And I'm just adding this in the exact same fashion as last time, not covering up the entire opening of the stencil in just a bit. So I love experimenting with two tones of inks like this because it makes such a unique and different looking panel. So now I'm going ahead with the detail portion of the stencil, and for this one I'm adding some peach fuzz. So again, remember you have some leaves that are going to be open and not fully covered with ink, and then I'll go ahead and add the mint again just to create the shading and fill in all of those highlights with a bit darker version of the mint ink. So I just want to take a second to make a correction. On the first panel, I didn't actually use mint. I'm using it here on the second. On the first panel, I used fresh pear, which is easy to remember because we're coloring in pears. So anyways, let's finish up this panel and move on to the cutting portion, which I think is the fun part because you kind of see all of these little images come to life once they're cut out. So actually, before I went ahead and did that, I decided that the pink and the mint, it didn't really look, it looked grayish, right? So, well, you can always do this, go back and add more pink so that just looks a little bit more pink and the mixing isn't as much, and that looks a little better. So I'm grabbing my my die, and I can go ahead and fasten this to my panel and cut it out. I generally like to just use some washi tape. You can use any type of low tack tape, and I'll just fasten it in two areas and put it through, and it tends to stay in place, and all of these little bits come out so nicely. You can see they just pop right out, and they look absolutely stunning once they're all cut out. So now I'm going ahead and making my card bases, and I'm going to need two A2 sized card bases, and they're both basically going to be, I'd say, top folding. So I've cut an 8.5 by 11-inch white piece of cardstock in half lengthwise at 4 1/4, and then I'm just scoring it at 5.5 and folding those both. So in the end, I actually decided to use one in the portrait fashion and one in landscape fashion. So these are my two card bases, and let's add those beautifully dried textured backgrounds. So I use the Tidal Pond and Passion Fruit here, but you could use any color you want. Just please remember to take into account that the whiteness of the texture paste is going to lighten your ink just a bit. So you can see that the Passion Fruit is actually a pretty deep, it's a pretty deep peachy yellow, orange color, and you can see it really lightened up here. Like I said, the other trick would be use a colored cardstock which matches the ink that you're using. So I basically cut just little bits off the edge. I'd say they were about 1/8 of an inch off of each edge of these panels, and now I'm adding some really strong ScrapbookPal tape to the back. And this is because they are kind of warped, so I want them to really sit flat on my panel. So my little trick is to just add some Tombow dot runner to the center, and this is before I remove any of those backings. I'll position it onto my card base so that I have the border that I'd like, and I can kind of move it around if I need to. Once I've got it where I like it, I will reach behind the panel and pull off all of those release papers for the double-sided adhesive, and then stick it down nice and firm. So I did that for both of the panels, and you can see how nice that texture on the panel looks. Now I'm also going to grab my vellum, and I'm going to cut two rectangles that are about 2 by 3 inches, and I'm making them pretty small because I don't want to cover up too much of that textured area, but I do want to mute it just a little bit in the center where I'm going to add all of my die cuts and my sentiment. Now let's go ahead and stamp out those sentiments. So I'm grabbing the two sentiments that actually have the coordinating dies in the set, and I'm so excited about that because if you know Pinkfresh Studio, normally the sentiments don't have dies for these larger sets. So this is actually pretty fun because I love getting a set where you can make everything in one go. You've got all your image stamps, you've got all of your sentiment stamps, and you can cut them out. So I've gone ahead and stamped out the Surround Yourself with Happiness, and I've embossed it again with that Lawn Fawn Gold embossing powder. And then I'm going to grab the second sentiment and stamp that out with some black VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink. So again, the colors I've chosen are matching the colors that I used to stamp out the images. And here are the coordinating dies for the sentiments. I always love this. I'm going to go ahead and cut those out. I'm using my sidekick here because these are smaller sentiments. I can fit it on. I don't have to put it through my big shot. And look how nicely they cut out. They look so beautiful. I love sentiments and sentiment dies. They have such a nice classic look. So those are the two we're using today. So now let's go ahead and finish this off and put all of these beautiful bits together, which is the most exciting part, I find. I'm grabbing my 3D foam squares and I'm just sparingly adding them to the back of these die cuts where I think that I want to have them stick up on the card. And the reason why is because then I have these other pieces like this pear that I want to add underneath, and I want to be able to slip it under with the foam without the foam coming into contact and kind of it hindering me placing it where I want. Now that I know where I've placed it on the vellum, so I've placed those die cuts on the vellum first, then I will add some more foam squares to the back where they're going to be covered up by the die cut image, and then I'll attach it to the. And this is basically how I ensure that all of my foam squares are going to be covered up by the die cut image on the front and not show through the vellum. So now I'm adding the sentiment that I stamped out with the VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink, and I'm adding just a couple foam squares and some glue to attach it to the die cuts, and then I added another foam square behind the vellum to make sure it's securely on that card base. Moving on to the next card, I've got my vellum again, and I'm positioning my pears and all of these pomegranates with this other color scheme. I'm doing it in the exact same fashion, so I'm adding just a minimal amount of foam squares to get those die cuts on there, and then I'll add the pieces that I want with glue that are going to be more flat and adhere to the vellum and the front of the card. And I'll just kind of position them on the vellum how I see fit. Now remember, the vellum is a bit smaller than the actual background, so I can have these pieces overhanging a bit. And then it's just really about getting that sentiment on there as well. So I only really had to add one of those little foam squares. I love that foam square pack because it has a couple sizes, so I don't have to worry about cutting things down too much. The small squares usually fit my sentiments, and the larger ones, the bigger die cuts. So again, I'm adding more of the foam on the back where all the die cuts are so that it's disguised, and then I'll just center it onto my card base. So you can see I'm removing it and kind of repositioning it here. Those foam squares, as long as you haven't pressed down too hard and waited too long, are pretty much repositionable, and once they're down there for a while, they will stick really well. Now, I had a bunch of die cuts left over, so I decided to decorate the inside of my card. So I actually took that big pear bunch and I cut it in half and put it on either side of the inside of my card, and then added the extra little pomegranates around it. I then grabbed one of the shorter sentiments and stamped that on there with some black VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink. I basically had to eyeball it and basically stamp it down with my acrylic block. And then I did the exact same thing for the second card. I just arranged the pears a little differently because it is portrait. And you can see I had an issue with stamping that down. My stamp was a bit messy. And you can see that I have actually a portion of the D kind of messed up, and that's okay. Sometimes that happens with the stamp sets you get. I just get out my Micron pens and I fix it. It didn't really look great once I fixed it, so I decided to actually stamp another sentiment and cut it out and then adhere that. So that's always another little trick. If you have an issue stamping your sentiment and it doesn't come out well, you can always stamp it on something else and attach it. Now for the front of my card, let's go ahead and finish them off with some embellishments. I have some Pinkfresh Studio Iridescent drops. Now these are really nice and they came out with the last release. They're a must-have, I've got to say. So I added a bunch of those to the peachy card, and then for the aqua card, I'm adding the gold metallic pearls by Pinkfresh Studio. And those are basically the two cards that I have to share with you today. So I hope that you've been fully inspired to create with these Pears and Pomegranate suite. Don't forget that everything that's been used in this video has been linked in the description below, so you can always click there to see and shop for what you want. And again, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Scrapbook Pal YouTube channel and hit that notification bell so that you can be notified of future videos. Thank you all for joining me today, and I'll see you guys again next time. Bye.